2.
Hi, I'm Dr. David D. Weisher. I've been a physician here in the Virgin Islands for over 10 years. And right next to me here is Mr. Neal Weiss, who I've known for quite some time. One of the things I've realized since I've been living here for over 10 years is how often you meet some very interesting people. And I think that I wanted to do this because I wanted to show that Neal Weiss is one of the most interesting people I've ever met. He was involved very deeply in World War II and was actually a prisoner in Germany at of Stalag I. But anyways, why don't we start from the very beginning, Mr. Weiss. You were born in New York, correct?
Correct.
What year was that, if you don't mind?
1924.
All right. And your mother passed away at an early age.
Giving birth to a baby girl.
Okay. And you were raised by a stepmother.
No, I was raised by my grandparents from the age of 6 to 13.
Uh-huh.
Then my father remarried when I was 13, and I had this stepmother who we won't use words about till the age of 17. Then my father separated from her, and he and I went to live on our own on Broadway in New York.
Mm-hmm. And then you've heard of Pearl Harbor. That was December 7th, 1941. What was going on in your mind at that time?
Well, it was very simple if you were there. You had two options. Either you got drafted or you enlisted. If you were drafted, you went in the Army. That meant trenches, no toilets, no milk, and I was a milk boy. So I wanted to be in the Air Force, wake up in a bed, and if I was going to die, it was going to be clean.
No messy stuff. So you joined the Army Air Corps, correct?
I joined it 6 months after the war started.
I see. And you went to San Antonio.
That was in January. It took them a time to bring us up because there was so much going on in such a short period of time. But we were brought in January to San Antonio, Texas.
And this is where you did
basic training.
Basic training. Yeah. And then after that, you went to Walla Walla, Washington.
No. After that, they told me that I was qualified for a bombardier or a navigator or a pilot, but they needed bombardiers, so they wanted me to go to bombardier. I resisted. They said, try it. I tried it and went to Ellington Field, Houston, Texas, for primary training. That was 90 days, and or 60 days. Once I graduated from that, I still wanted to be a pilot. They talked me out of it, sent me to Childress, Texas, which was advanced training for bombardiers. And I graduated from that July 15th, 1943.
Where does Walla Walla, Washington come into play?
Once you got graduated, Walla Walla was training in a B-17. Up until then, you're only in twin-engine planes, AT-10s. Walla Walla, Washington gave you combat training in the planes that you're going to fly in combat.
Mm-hmm. And was it after Walla Walla, Washington that you then went to England?
Went to Little Dix in New York, Camp Dix, and then on to England via Queen Elizabeth I.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that must have been a harrowing experience because there were lots of U-boats out there at that time.
And there were a lot of people on the boat that the U-boats would like to have.
I'm sure.
But the QE-1 was very fast, and they operated top speed, and we got to Greenock, Scotland in 5.5 days.
Wow. Did you have any naval escort for the QE-2 during that trip?
To tell you the truth, I don't remember seeing any, but there might have been.
Okay, all right. So then we went to England, and you did a first a mission as a bombardier in France. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was December the 4th, 1943. It was the bombing in Marseille of the airfield there. That was Hermann Göring's Yellow Nose Squadron.
Mm-hmm. I just want to put up here, this is the crew, if we can, Neal Weiss. And he's in the upper, let me take a look at that, right here, the very top, your left, my right, your left, that's him with his crew with the B-17 bomber. Then also we have, this is a personal picture of Neal Weiss in those days with his uniform.
That was right after the war.
So then that first mission, I guess that was a success?
Not really. We had cloud cover, so we weren't allowed to bomb on France directly. So unless we saw the target, we couldn't drop our bombs. Mm-hmm. So we ended up dropping the bombs in the North Sea.
Oh, okay. And then we had our second mission, which was over Germany.
It was supposed to be what they called a milk run, mm-hmm. because Emden, Germany was right on the coast, and it was a submarine base, and it was supposed to be a milk run because it was such a short distance.
Mm-hmm. And you were also supposed to have fighter escort, I believe, on that trip.
This was supposed to be the first fighter escort. We were a couple of minutes late. They were a couple of minutes early. We engaged the German Me-109s before the fighter escort ever got mm-hmm. there.
The Me-109 was a German fighter plane.
Yeah, Messerschmitt.
Messerschmitt. And so what happened on that flight?
Well, we first had planes coming out of our left side. Anyway, we were in the third plane that morning. First two planes we couldn't get off. And instead of having the up-to-date bombardiers, twin 50 calibers that you sat on and fired, and then you had a 50 on either side that the navigator operated, depending on where the Germans were coming from. The first pass they made didn't come all the way, was from the left. And I said, don't pay attention. They're going to come out of the sun. Forget them. Sure enough, they took off. Next thing I knew, they were coming out of the sun.
And basically, then the plane, I guess, went out of control at that time?
No, the first pass, they killed the navigator. He was sitting on an ammunition box. Bullet went through his head, went through my heavy fleece-lined jacket. Called into the pilot, said, Schlafner looks dead to me. I can't see because the nose had frozen up because it had gotten wet and the silicone that was supposed to clear it didn't. I says, let's get the hell out of here. The pilot says, this is a milk run. Let's stick with it. Next thing I know, the plane peeled off to the right, and I thought he was taking my advice. But he wasn't. He went into an inside spin. I was flipped up into the nose. Schlafner obviously was dead. When you're the bombardier, you're the gunnery control officer. I called out. Anybody can hear me? Nobody answered. And it was like a bad movie. All I saw was the earth winding up and me not able to get out of where I was. Centrifugal force kept me there, plus the 50 caliber, because we had 350s, because we were in a very early model plane. The 50, which was on a spring, came up, which wouldn't have made any difference, helped pin me into the nose. For reasons that I don't know any more than you do, we came out of an inside spin, went into a flat outside spin. When that happened, I came down to the ground, and I was one of the few that was wearing a parachute, because a sergeant came up to me just before takeoff. He says, "Lieutenant, you have to take this up. Tell me how it works for a bombardier." I says, "Don't bother me. I got an armed 350s. He says, "Please, I'll lose a stripe." I took it, so I had it on. Other than the pilot and co-pilot, nobody on the crew had their chutes. Of course, they were on the floor, and you had a harness, you hooked them on. That's when you took off. Put the plane on an inside spin, then an outside spin. Nobody could catch up with their chutes.
So that saved your life. I mean, that was, without that, you wouldn't be here.
It saved my life for two reasons. One, the explosion, which, as I said, or I told you previously, the plane blew up at about 5,000 or 6,000 feet. The reason I knew the approximate altitude is because that's where the cloud cover was. And I had worked my way back thinking that the reason that it went into an outside spin is that the pilot and co-pilot were wounded, not dead, and they had tried to get the plane out. When I got back to the companionway between the pilot's compartment and the bombardier's compartment and looked up, it's all on fire. And the top gunner, which was the engineer, was slumped over his gun. So instead of that, turned around, opened up the escape hatch in the bottom of the plane, was sitting there, and the next thing I knew, I was going through the cloud. I remember pulling my chute. I woke up on the ground, I don't know how much longer later. Thought I was dead.
Basically, you were on your back, on the ground, looking at the sky.
Looking at a blue sky, and nobody knew what it was to die.
Mm-hmm. So you thought is this what it's like to be dead?
Well, because I couldn't hear anything.
Yeah.
And what later turned out I had a concussion. And my heavy jacket had gone, my boots had gone, and I remembered from the Boy Scouts or something, is that if you could wiggle your toes, your legs weren't broken. Mm-hmm. And I could wiggle my toes, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed from the waist down.
So how were you discovered? Who came to you first when you were there on the ground?
A couple of women came running across the field. We were in a farmer's. I was in a farmer's.
This was in Germany?
In Germany, in Emden. And they came to me carrying a blanket. And I reached in my pocket for a cigarette, and all of a sudden a young kid, about 15, come running up, straddled me and started to beat the hell out of me. He thought I was going for a gun. So that ended. They pulled him off of me. And the next thing, I didn't hear, because I had a hearing. There was a tremendous bump on the ground. They threw the blanket on me. I found out is that some 17 had salvoed 10 500-pounders. But fortunately, instead of coming to me, they went away the other way. Mm-hmm. Then a couple of men came out, put me on a wooden stretcher, took me into a bakery, the back of a bakery, but before that, the air raid was over. People were lined up on both sides of the street, throwing stones, spitting, etc.
At you?
Obviously, yeah. And I ended up laying on a couch. They gave me an apple, and about an hour later, the ambulance came, and as they got in, I heard a guy speaking English. I said, "Who is it?" He says, "Steele, who are you?" I told him. He was the co-pilot on one of the other planes in the squadron. He happened to be severely wounded. Also, all of the meat between his knee and his groin underneath was gone because he was a co-pilot, and a 20 millimeter had blew up underneath his seat, which was parachute. Of course, they sat on their parachutes. Mm-hmm. They took us to the hospital.
That was Emden Marine Hospital in
Right.
Emden, Germany. And what transpired then?
Well, then I was laying on the floor, I don't know how long. in a hallway. And all of a sudden, a man came up in a white cotton jacket, white cotton pants, and turned around and said, Kriegsgefangenen, which in Germany means prisoner of war. I said, and then he turned to me and he said, Êtes-vous anglais? Well, I took enough high school French to know that one. And I said, no, je suis américain. And he said, Êtes-vous juif? And I'd never heard the word juif before. I says, ne comprends, I don't understand. He says, moi catholique, êtes-vous juif? Well, you didn't have to draw a picture. I says, pourquoi? Why? He says, ne parlons, don't tell him. Next thing he did is he reached down, took my dog tags off, and says, I will, in French, I'll get rid of him. And then a little while later, they took me up, put me on an examining table in the room. Doctor came in, spoke perfect English, said he had studied at Edinburgh University, and he said name, rank, and serial number. Then he said religion. I said, I don't have to give you religion. That's the Geneva Convention. He says, Lieutenant, because they didn't know those bars, flight office. Mm-hmm. He says, Lieutenant, you're bleeding through the nose, bleeding through the mouth, you're paralyzed from the waist down. He says, all we want to know is your religion because you may die. We want to know how to bury you. My hand to Almighty, I said, in the ground. He laughed like hell. And all I could think of, because if I said something Protestant or Catholic, a Jewish kid from Broadway in New York didn't know anything about Catholics and Protestants, and all I could think of was my stepmother, who had a religion called Christian Scientist. So I said, Christian Scientist. He says, what's that? I says, an American religion. He says, so. If you look on my prisoner of war card, it says Christian Scientist. The thing I didn't know is that Christian Scientists don't believe in medical attention.
Right. So it's a good thing that they didn't know that either.
Yeah, well, they didn't even know the religion.
I wanted to show this picture also. This is the Purple Heart here for Mr. Neal Weiss. And what is this below here? What is this?
That's my dog tag from the prison camp. If you look underneath, it says Stalag Luft 1.
Okay. Very interesting. So basically, then you were in the hospital. You recuperated from the hospital. I guess he did surgery
3 months.
For 3 months, and then they transported you to Stalag 1.
Well, no. First, they transported me to what they call the Dulag, with Cooper, another bombardier who had been shot down on the previous raid and only had one leg. So the two of us on crutches were put on a train. Admiral Dennett chased us out of the hospital. He's the man that surrendered to the Allies. And we were on a train. We got to Cologne, which was an elevated station. You could see in any direction. Every house was bombed out. And we had a guard, not very big, with a gun. And all of a sudden, a whole bunch of people start heading towards us. And I said to the guard, what's los? What's going? He says, they want to push you in front of the train. I says, point the gun. And he did, and they backed off. We got to Frankfurt, got in the station where the Dulag is right outside. There's an air raid. So they put us down in the air raid shelter in the station. But who's down there? A lot of Germans who weren't happy seeing us. So we were sitting under tension.
I'm sure. This is life and death.
Yeah, but for some reason we're different than what we hear today of the so-called people who are suffering from
post-traumatic stress.
If they were there, they would have died there. And then they took us to the Dulag, which was 10 days of solitary confinement. And I was being interrogated every day. I was in a solitary cell, 9 feet long, 6 feet wide, with a little window overlooking the courtyard. The buildings were built in a square. And I would go out, they'd walk me across the courtyard, and the captain would ask me the same questions, ba-boom, ba-boom. Finally he says, you know, you don't have a dog tag, you're a spy, we can shoot you. I said, I couldn't help losing the dog tag. The plane exploded. He says, that's your story. So the next day, they lined me up against the wall, and 2 Germans with guns and arms kept me there for about 15 minutes, and I didn't know whether they were going to shoot me or not. And this went on for 3 days. Finally, on the 3rd day, he says, Lieutenant, you've been down 3 months. There's nothing you can tell me that I don't know. I says, yeah, I says, Keith Pickle was my pilot. Who was my co-pilot? He says, stop playing games. Keith Pickle was your co-pilot. Your pilot's name was Ryan. I says, where's my crew? He says, they're all dead. Plane blew up. I says, well, if you know all of this, why have you got me here now for 9 or 10 days? He says, the one thing you learn, Lieutenant, is there is information and confirmation. And information isn't worth a damn until you have confirmation. With that, there was a shade. Pull the shade up. There was England. He says, you're in the 390th Bomb Group, 570th Squadron, and you had fresh eggs the morning you were shot down, and your name was on the board to be promoted to a lieutenant. I says, I give up.
Amazing. They had all that information.
They knew everything.
Amazing.
Knew everything.
And then from there, I guess, then after that interrogation, is that when they brought you into the
They put us in boxcars, like the 40 and 10 from World War I. We went day and a half or 2 days. Took us to Stalag 1 because that's all the way up in East-North Germany. And we were on crutches, Cooper and I, so we were slower than the rest. And we got into this room. There was a big oven in the room.
Wow.
And we didn't know what that was for. And the guard came in who spoke some English. I says, was ist los? What's that? He says, take your clothes off. They wanted to decontaminate them or something. They had racks that came out of the oven. So we thought maybe we were still going to live. After that, he says, now into the shower. We go into this room. I look up. There's nozzles in the ceiling. I says, holy mackerel, it's gas.
This is it.
But it was water.
So you really took a shower.
Took a shower. Then they sprayed you with delousing material.
And then you were assigned
No, then you went through the gate to the prison camp compound, and a guy came over, grabbed you. He says, come on, you need a hot meal. Come with us. Everybody was grabbed by a different prisoner. And they went in, and they had what is known as an XYZ committee, which is a long story. And they were the security committee. And they said, oh, you're from New York? I says, yeah. He says, that's where the Brooklyn Dodgers come from. I says, no, that's where the New York Yankees come. They were testing me because the Germans had planted people in the prison camp. Finally, they accepted that I was clean. I ended up in South Compound.
So that's like a takeoff from the movie Starlark 17, I believe. But they actually had a gopher in the prison camp that was getting information.
They didn't last very long.
What was it like? Now, my understanding is that these camps were controlled by the Luftwaffe. That was Hermann Goering's.
No, the camp was controlled by the army. Most people don't understand there were 2 Germanys. There was Hitler Germany and the Prussians. Now, the Prussians were the aristocrats of the German army. And the Geneva Convention was the Geneva Convention. And they followed it to a T as long as they could. Towards the very last 4 months, Hitler had specified that no Red Cross parcels, which we were getting about every 2 or 3 weeks, could come in anymore because they had to be transferred from Lubbock to the prison camp. It was over 25 kilometers. No way. We were down to 750 calories a day.
So you were basically starving.
I hate to tell you that, but some guys ate cats.
Wow.
Some ate birds.
Wow. Now also, there was a newspaper in these camps, the sort of their propaganda, and we have here a copy, the OK. What does the OK stand for?
Overseas Kid.
Overseas Kid. And this was basically the German interpretation of the events of the war.
Well, it wasn't their interpretation, it was their propaganda.
Their propaganda, correct, correct. And how often did this come out?
Oh, about every 2 weeks, except towards the end. You see, we had a radio, and we knew more about what was going on in the war than they did. So they used to come to us every morning to want to know what news we had, because they were getting nothing but propaganda, and we were getting the news from England.
How did you get the news from England? Was this
On
in
the
letters,
radio.
or were you allowed to listen to the radio, or was this some sort of?
They spent all 17 months trying to find it. It was never in the same place twice. I never knew where it was. The XYZ committee knew where it was. And obviously, from what I'm going to tell you, they developed a radio that could transmit, because Hitler ordered the commanding officer of our camp that if he couldn't march us out so the Russians couldn't liberate us, he was to kill us. And he came to our commander and told him, and he says, look, I know you got a radio, get in touch with England and tell them if it comes down to a push and a shove, to fly in a brigade of paratroopers to protect you. So we had, at the end of the war, transmitting.
So
These guys were so clever. You saw the wings they made. They could do anything.
No, this was from the commanding officer of the camp.
Of the Germans.
The Germans. So he was concerned about your well-being.
Oh, yeah. In fact, that card, which is the Germans' identification card, he gave all of the cards back to our commander, who was Colonel Zemke, who was the top fighter race in World War II.
Wow, isn't that something? Now, how long were you in the camp?
I was in the hospital 3 months, the camp 14 months.
14 months. Did you have a specifically assigned duty while you were in the camp? Did you have did they assign you at a specific function?
They didn't assign me. I got lucky. I was in what they call South Camp. There was a Major Fisher in the camp. He says, Neal, we were good friends. He says, Neal, they're opening up North 1. That was another compound. He said, I'm going to make you food exchange officer. What the food exchange is, you got your Red Cross parcel, you got Spam, you preferred corned beef, you brought it to me. I gave you 96 points. It was on a bank book like. 2 points went to the XYZ committee, 1 point went to me. So I ran the food exchange right up until the end of the war.
So this is really an education on business for you.
Oh, yeah, well, it wasn't difficult. It was only 2 points or 1 point. You didn't have much math to figure that out.
Basically, later on, I guess, the war had ended and then the Russians came in.
No, the war hadn't ended. Oh, by the way, as an aside and interest to get to, a kid named Danny Bishop, who came from Hell's Kitchen in New York, went to DeWitt Clinton High School, same as me. We met in prison camp 3 years later. Anyway, the war was still going on, but the Russians were coming and the Germans were fleeing. So when they fled the camp, Danny and I went through a hole in the fence that somebody else beat us to, and we went south to go west, and we ended up in no man's land and got overrun by a drunken Russian who tried to kill us. And I was wearing an an A2 jacket with a B-17 on the back, an American flag. And that was General Rokochowski's First Army that had been held up at Stettin for 30 days. They were slaughtered. The Americans came in with 1,000 bombers in the day. English came in at 1,000 at night. They walked across the water. So Russians thought we were and when this Andre saw because Danny came out of one side of the house, I came out, and Danny kept yelling, "Nick Schussen, don't shoot, don't shoot." I came around the other side, and he came after me, and I said, "Nick Schussen," turned my back, saw the flag, saw the plane, dropped his gun, hugged us, kissed us. This is, Russians have two emotions,
Right.
love and hate.
Right.
There's nothing in between.
And nothing in between. So then they loved you. This statement here, this was from Karl Dennett's when the war was over.
Yeah, well, this was the leaflet they dropped on Germany, announcing that the war was over.
And this has the signature of Admiral Karl Dennett on
Yeah.
it. This is falling apart here.
You see, Roosevelt had just died, and what the Russians couldn't believe that we weren't wearing black armbands, but we didn't know why we were supposed to. And they told us that President Roosevelt had died. How come you weren't wearing an armband?
Now, this signature with Karl Dennett's, he was the admiral.
Admiral Dennett.
Admiral Karl Dennett of the U-boat fleet, and he was personally assigned the Fuhrer after Hitler died. And Hitler assigned him the Fuhrer, so that was his signature there. Now, when was it, what was the date that you, approximately, that you left the camp? When was?
About 8 days before the war officially ended and before we ran into the American Army.
Okay, so this was
That
after
was in
Hitler.
Schwerin,
This was
Germany.
after Hitler committed suicide.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That was in Schwerin, Germany, is where we ran into them. Americans.
Okay, and so now you were in the Russian hands.
No. I was in the Russian hands, which you don't want to hear all those stories. For about 8 days, we found an American sergeant in a Jeep behind the Russian lines with submachine guns and 45s loaded in the back of the Jeep. He was a master sergeant. I says, "What the hell are you doing?" He says, "Come on, the war's about over. These guys are stealing all the jewelry and everything else. I give them guns, they give me jewelry."
So basically you're outside the camp, you're with the Russians, the war is almost over, and you've got another couple of more days, a few more days. What did you do at that time?
When?
Just before the war ended, did you?
You mean when I joined up with the Americans?
Yeah.
They had a place in a movie house on the second floor, which is the balcony, I guess. And you signed in because you were going to get some money, because our pay continued as if we were flying. So, I got over $4,000 when the war was over, which was a lot of cotton-picking money in those days. And the guy takes our name, serial number, everything. And I says, "Where do we sleep?" He gives me a blanket, and Danny says, "You sleep on the floor." I says, "Are you kidding? We won the war, not them. I ain't sleeping on the floor. There's houses here. I'm going to sleep in a house." Danny and I went in, knocked on the door, one of these two-story houses around the lake. The woman opened the door. We pushed our way in. Said, "Give us food." She brought out food because we had the guns. The Russians had given us guns. And we had the kid eat the food first. And we slept there. But she went out supposedly to get bread. She went out and got the MPs. This MP came to the door. He said, "Lieutenant, what are you doing here?" It's very simple. "I'm going to sleep here." Danny says, "You got a problem?" He says, "You can't do that." I says, "You're going to stop us. We're ex-POWs. Don't mess." Because we were allowed to do any damn thing we wanted. He left, and the provost marshal showed up. We went through the same threatening with him, and he knew we weren't kidding. He says, "You be at the police station tomorrow morning. We're getting rid of you two. You're nothing but trouble. Be my guest."
So
they flew us to Le Havre.
To Le Havre. And then you were in Germany for quite some time after that, right?
I went back to Germany December 31st, 46. So that was 47. The war ended in May of 45. So it was only about 17 months after the war ended.
This is a picture we have of the Americans and the Russians.
Yeah, that's a commercial picture that appeared in all the American newspapers, the military newspapers.
So anyways, you stayed in Germany.
I didn't stay in Germany. I went home. And I didn't have a high school education. I didn't have a home. My father was in Buffalo, New York. I was in San Antonio, Texas. And I never drove a car in my life. And I bought a car from a guy from Wisconsin. It was a 1939 rumble seat Packard. And I drove the car from Texas to Buffalo, New York in the middle of the winter. Mm-hmm. And I never drove a car before in my life. In Memphis, I had stripped the clutch. The car was in the middle of the street, wouldn't go either way. 7 o'clock in the morning, a whole bunch of people came out. I was in the uniform with the wings and the whole bit. And they said, "What's happened, Lieutenant?" "I don't know. The car won't move forward or backward." "Wait a minute." Brought a guy out from a garage. He says, "You stripped the clutch. I'll have it ready in an hour." I said, "How much is it going to be?" He says, "Are you kidding? Go with them. They're going to give you breakfast. I'll give you a clutch." Did that, and I drove all the way up to Buffalo.
But you did go back to Germany.
That's when the job, I went to California with a guy who was looking somebody to ride because I threw the rods on the Packard, and he wanted to go. He wanted somebody to share expenses. I went to California because my mother's brother was out there. Had a great time with the movie stars. They thought we were all heroes, and I had a job with May Company for $17 a week selling neckties. It was a long way from being a flying officer at 250. That lasted about 6 weeks. I said I had enough of this, and I took a DC-3 military and flew all the way from California back to New York and stayed with a boy named Alan Friedman, who I grew up with and was really my brother. And his parents were my parents, because when I was living with the stepmother, I used to run away every 2 days. And his sister was the buyer for Macy's. And she says, "Neal, I'll get you a job." That time, Reynolds ballpoint pens were coming on the market, the first ballpoint. I went in as a salesperson, but because of my father's training, I knew how to decorate knew how to manage because I'd been in office. And somebody came in to buy a ballpoint pen. The girl couldn't sell it to him. I went in, sold it to him. He says, "What are you doing here? You're wasting your time." I said, "I got nowhere else to go." He says, my name is Jerry Adler. I'm the personal manager of the PX system. He says, "I'll give you a job as a manager for $4,700 a year." I says, "Where?" He says, "Germany." I says, "No, thanks. I just came from there. If you change your mind," gave me a card. It was the holiday season. Macy's had us working weekends. I had a free day on a Monday. I was despondent. I was fed up. I went to Jerry Adler, 25 West 43rd. He says, "Boy, am I glad to see you. Fill it out." I filled it out. He looked at it. He says, "You're 22? I says, "Yeah, why?" He says, "You're managing a Macy department." He says, "You're a bombardier officer and you're 22? I says, "Yes." He says, "I can't give you a job as a manager, 22. I says, "Fine, forget it." He says, No. I'll give you a job as an assistant manager. I will personally guarantee 90 days you'll be a manager." Went over to Germany, landed there December 31st, 46. Went to Garmisch-Partenkirchen, which was where the Olympics were held in 36. Found that the guy who was managing the PX, I was supposed to be assistant. He was hustling everything. I didn't know from anything. I called Ryan up. I says, "I got to talk to you. This guy is faking the cigarette sheet." She had a sheet of paper. There was supposed to be 100 cigarette stamps on it. Of course, the GI would give you one stamp. Every week, he'd give him a card. He said, "Neal, come on up." Came up. He said, "I'm making you manager of Carlsfeld Ordnance Depot," which was outside of Munich. It was the BMW works. Make a long story short, I was becoming a degenerate. There were so many women you couldn't believe it because there was no men. I was
Basically,
drinking.
you killed them all.
Huh? Killed them all. I was drinking like hell. And this is a violation of the culture I come from. He then promoted me to district supervisor of the southern area of Germany. I came to him and said, "I'm sorry, I'm quitting. This thing is making me a wrong type of person." He says, "Neal, wait." He says, "The Berlin airlift has started. They're opening 7 exchanges in England. I'll get you the job of chief of operations." I was there to end the story. 30 days later, they made me general manager of England at the age of 24.
So you really rose rather rapidly.
Oh, yeah.
There was an interesting story also about something about Israel and firing pins. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, obviously what I'm telling you, thank goodness, happened 50 years ago. All German pre-war coins were 935 coins. The black market was controlled by the rabbis who came out of the camps alive. And they were buying up all the coins they could get their hands on, shipping them to Milano, Italy. It was melted down, made into silver jewelry. It was being sold to help finance the war in Israel, because the Israelis were at that time forbidden. They couldn't have guns. The British and the French had embargoed the hell out of them. So I took a couple of trips, got 400 script. Now they don't have dollars. Then one day he came to me. He says, "Neal, I got 200 kilos, but they're not silver. They're Lamitz and Medvar coin needles." I says, "What's a Lamitz and Medvar needle?" He says, it's an industrial sewing machine. I says, "What the hell are they doing with that?" He says, "They've been embargoed against buying weapons. So they've gone to Czechoslovakia's Skoda works, and they've bought rifles without firing pins. So it wasn't a weapon. These needles, when they get them, they're going to break the shank off because it's got a big head on it. It's industrial. And they use the head as a firing pin.
So that helped the Israeli.
Oh, they could buy all the guns they
wanted. And they work now.
And they,
We're getting close to the final few minutes here. And I just want to get into one final aspect of your life, and that is you've done very well as an entrepreneur, as a businessman. And how did all that get started briefly now? You were in the wire business, and you were also, you sold conduits?
I came back from England with my wife who was pregnant. And I told you I grew up with 17 kids. And one of them was working for 3 brothers who were entrepreneurs. And he was the manager of their burlap bag department. I says, Bob, I need a job. He says, let me check with Sam. They were going to be the Levitt of New Jersey. They were building 10,000 houses. He says, Neal, I can get you a job down in Neptune City, New Jersey, selling houses. In the meantime, Alan, the other guy, his sister says, Neal, if you want to go back with Macy's, I can get you a job wearing a boutonniere and walking the floor. That job was 15 minutes from home. This job was an hour. There was no super highways. But I figured 3 entrepreneurs, they need me as much as I need them. So I took the job and drove a Mercedes-Benz, which I had, to, that's another story, to Neptune City, sold houses. The man who was running the project for Gitlin was his partner in building, and he asked me one day to help him make the payroll. In those days, it was a brown envelope. You put the cash in. It took me exactly 3 weeks to figure out that there was more envelopes than there were employees. Plus, I followed a truck that day that emptied half of its load at our site. I followed him down. He went to another site, unloaded, said to the guy there, whose project is this? He says, Chris Schluter. I said, oh, yeah? Schluter was Gitlin's partner. Called up Gitlin, who didn't know me very well, obviously. And I says, look, you've done me a favor. Give me a job. I owe my loyalty. Schluter's taking it. He says, come on up to Newark. He says, tomorrow morning you're the buyer. So I was the buyer for 10,000 houses.
And so you were, that's how you got to selling conduits, buying and selling conduits.
No, there was the houses had to be stopped building because sheetrock was too expensive because of the war. I was at 1407 Broadway, which is where their offices became. And there was an ad in the Wall Street Journal, because I was looking for a job. It says, looking to buy builder refrigerators. Well, that's what I had. I had written a purchase order for 10,000 with GE Supply in Newark. And the back of the purchase order said, this order is cancelable by the buyer only. Mm-hmm. I called him up. He says his name was Lester Dorfman. He says, what do you want? He says, I need refrigerators. Do you have any? I said, yeah, I got a few. I was paying $120. He says, how much are they? I said, $190. He said, hell, that's expensive. I said, much cheaper when I don't have them. Mm-hmm. So he says, can you ship them to 11th Avenue? We start shipping those. One day he called me up and says, can you get conduit? I knew what conduit is, like you know where the Pope lives. I said, sure, because I could always get anything you wanted. The easiest way to make a buck is find out what somebody wants.
Right.
And I called Carl Schleg up. I says, do you have galvanized? He says, Neal, galvanized takes a priority. I can give you a black conduit. Sold the black conduit with this guy, Dorfman. looked in the yellow pages of the book, telephone book, and there was electrical wholesalers. I says, you know, you're not married to GE. Called up L&B Electric in Brooklyn. I says, do you have conduit? He says, are you kidding? We got tons of it. We're in New York. Priority? Yeah. Galvanized? Sure. Started to sell galvanized. And one day, to finish the story, Lester said, I came in the morning, says, I need 50 carloads of galvanized conduit. I said, you out of your mind. That's National Electrical Products, 1 month. He says, Neal, I got it sold. Get it. Called up Lifton. I says, can you get the president of National Electric? He says, sure. I says, let's go up and see him. Got a hold of Gitlin, the guy who I was working for. Said, give me a check for $100,000. Made out to National Electric, which he did. We went up there. I said, Mr. Robinson, I need 50 carloads. He says, Mr. Weiss, you know, that's my total production. I said, I want to ask you a question. Where are the 50 carloads going? He says, well, you know, all over the United States. He says, you got, what, 20, 30 accounts receivables? He says, sure. He said, here's $100,000. I want the conduit. He says, you bought the conduit. As we were getting ready to leave, which will get me to the wire business, he says, Mr. Weiss, where are you buying your wire from? I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. Of course, I didn't know wire went in conduit.
You didn't even know what a conduit was at that time.
Well, by then I knew it was a pipe.
Right.
So when I says, Al, come on outside. I said, Al, what the hell is he talking about? He says, well, if you got conduits, you need wire. I says, well, you got the priority? He says, yeah. I said, how is it sold? He says, I buy it at 15 off the sheet. I said, great, I'll make a deal with you. I'll buy it, you store it, I'll pay for it, and I'll sell it. You get half of the 15 off the sheet. That's how I got in the wire business.
So anyways, from then, to make a long story short, you took a company, went public, and
In 68.
did very...
That was after I went into business for myself.
Yeah, all that without a high school education, and I think that Mr. Weiss, you're an incredible, interesting person, and I thank you for coming in today for this interview.
Equally as important, I appreciate the compliment.
Oh, thank you, Neal. And I think that's about it. Thank you.
Great.